All right, we are now live for the December AMA, that's Ask Me Anything session for 2019. This is the last one of the year. While I'm waiting for people to show up and get questions up there for me, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about how the month is turning out. So I've got my daughter here in Milwaukee. She just did auditions at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and we went to the library and to the museum just a few minutes ago. We just got back. So it's a beautiful day out here, cold though, in Milwaukee. And what else have we got going on? Well, I'm driving her back down tomorrow. Got the AMA, of course, today, and a few other things. Then we're heading over to Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design for their Christmas sale, so I could see what some of my students have been doing as far as their arts and crafts, and maybe find some decent Christmas presents for everyone. All right, so we've already got a question from Lyndon. Nice to see you here, Lyndon. Have any philosophers talked about procrastination, either causes, solutions, or what it reveals about humanity? I don't know that anyone except for very recent contemporary philosophers, and I don't know any of the ones who did it recently, have talked about procrastination by that name, because I think it's a fairly recent word. But there's people who have talked about the concept. It definitely fits into the earlier discussions, starting with Evagrius Ponticus and John Cassian, and then like moving into the 7 deadly sins area of the 8 capital vices, because it ties in with Acadia, or sometimes it's called the noonday devil, which is this sort of occupying oneself with stuff that's not in the purview of what one's supposed to be doing. So, John Cassian, for example, talks about monks who, instead of like doing the stuff in their cell and saying their prayers and all that, they're like, I think I better go find out what Father John is up to. I think he needs some help over there. So there's discussions of that in that vein, and that gets rolled into sloth. Usually we think of sloth as kind of laziness, but procrastination isn't laziness as such. It's more a doing everything else other than what you're supposed to be doing. And I think that a lot of what other philosophers have to say about fear or anxiety could fit in with that, or pain or disappointment. So those would be the areas I would take a look at. Lord Awesome writes, what is humanity going through in the context of Nietzsche's everyone starting to reevaluate values, and is the internet and our access to information speeding this up? I wouldn't say that most people are actually reevaluating values. In that sense, most people are actually, whether they are politically or liberal or conservative, are actually quite conservative. They're not trying to change things in that sense. I gotta grab the cord that the cat just knocked out. I would say that what Nietzsche has in mind is not being done by most people, including most people who fancy themselves Nietzscheans, and think that they're the Ubermensch, or they think that Nietzsche can be harnessed for something, because he was so much against any sort of movement politics, including social and cultural movements, that he would say most people today are still within the orbit of dispositions that are ultimately feeding into nihilism, but trying to escape nihilism. So, all right, let's see. Dimitri, considering your speculative fiction series, when you might cover J.G. Ballard, do you see any issues with technology in the postmodern age? Going by the poll results, we're probably going to be covering Ballard, but that question is so vague, I don't know what to make of it. Issues with technology in the postmodern age. There's lots of issues with technology, but there's lots of issues with technology in every age, because to be human is to use technology. So maybe you could ask something a bit more specific. Bruno, what do you think of Alfred North Whitehead? What do you think about his process philosophy? I actually was very into Whitehead when I was an undergraduate. Read my way through Process and Reality. Probably didn't understand everything that I was reading. Probably I only understood half of it, but I got enough to actually that's enough, Amika. I got enough to actually sort of see his vision. The dog is growling at the cat because she thinks the cat's going to steal her food or something. I haven't read him for a long time, so I'm not all that qualified to say much about Whitehead. I will say I've read some of his other books, and I enjoy reading that stuff. But Process and Reality, that's something that I should get back to and read my way through again. It's just a matter of finding the time. If you're asking whether it's worth spending time reading Alfred North Whitehead, I would say definitely. He's very interesting. He's got some interesting perspectives that he's bringing to the table, and he doesn't fit neatly into the sort of narrative that we tell about philosophy. So he could be quite good to check out. All right. Jimmy Neutron weighs in that Whitehead was retroactively refuted by Guénon and Parmenides. I definitely don't think that's the case. Two Technic, do you think you'll make videos on Spinoza? I mean, maybe eventually. Hopefully I'll make videos on everybody, but Spinoza is not among my priorities because I don't typically teach Spinoza in classes. People ask me about that. Anybody is free if they want to commission me to make videos on a quicker timetable, but then you actually have to pay for it. So, people are always asking, what about Schopenhauer? Don't you like him? Yeah, it's not about whether I find somebody interesting. It's about mostly whether it's fitting into the resources that I need for my classes, or whether I see. Spinoza is interesting. I'd be much more likely to shoot videos on Pascal, who I think is, in some respects, more insightful than Spinoza, than I would on Spinoza. So I'd probably work my way through the Pensées. I'd shoot Spinoza before I'd shoot Malebranche, but I'd probably shoot Leibniz before I shoot Spinoza. So, all right. Anthony Fickery, do you have any thoughts on Charles Taylor's sources of the self and his work in general? Yeah, Taylor fits into that sort of spectrum of philosophers like Alasdair MacIntyre, who are doing really sort of big picture, what's been going on, what changed sort of stuff. I'm not as interested in Taylor as I am in MacIntyre, but I see them as within the same sort of overall project. Sources of the Self, it's definitely a book that you should get and read your way through. It's another person who is doing a similar project, but isn't in the same camp, you might say, is Jürgen Habermas, right, with his Philosophical Discourse of Modernity. Or another good book in that that segment would be Schneewin's The Invention of Autonomy, which unfortunately doesn't do a very good job of mentioning women philosophers, but otherwise is a pretty interesting sort of history of ideas thing. So that's where I see Taylor fitting in. What was the questions? Works in general. He's certainly somebody who's important and worth reading. I have limited time, so I don't think I'm probably going to go back to Taylor and spend much time on him. Whereas with MacIntyre, Chris Gill, or Julia Annas, or people like that, I definitely know it's worth my time to go back because it fits in more with the projects that I have. But you can certainly read them. I bet you can find sources of the self at a used bookstore very easily. Let's see here. I just saw a question. Here we go. There's a lot of questions now. Lowell asks, would you ever consider doing any videos on Plotinus or any Neoplatonists? I have done videos on Neoplatonists. Augustine, right? And Boethius. But yeah, I mean, more seriously, anybody in that strict Neoplatonist thing like Porphyry, I'd certainly do that. That's a gap. I don't teach them in my classes, so there's no real call for me to churn out videos right away because there's no need on the part of my students, but I find them very interesting and worth reading. So, I'm right now doing a lot of stuff on Simplicius and his commentary on Epictetus' Enchiridion. So, down the line, perhaps. Nicholas asks, I'm new to philosophy and interested in epistemology. What are some essential reads on Steele Manning, skepticism, and on arguments against it? I don't know. That sounds like a question for Google, or for other people. I don't spend a lot of time. I mean, Steele Manning is a relatively new term, an idea. So you could probably find more stuff out there on blog sites than you're going to find particularly good books. But any decent how to do argumentation book will probably get you started with that sort of thing. There aren't any sources that I particularly recommend for that. And skepticism, that covers an entire range of things. I don't know what you mean skepticism about social realities or moral realities or about the world in general. You could read the Skeptics, like Sextus Empiricus, or read the first part of Descartes, but then read the rest of Descartes' Meditations. But it's not really my area. Steele Manning is something that we were doing in the past. We just didn't congratulate ourselves on calling it Steele Manning. It was called the Principle of Charity, right? So. Yeah, I'm not really into a lot of those things. Hayden Labrie, I'm trying to get into Wittgenstein, the issue of language. Do you think language limits human reason? It depends on, you have to make a distinction there. It depends on what you mean by limits human reason. If you mean limits the possibilities for human reason for the entire human race, yes, in the sense that you always do have to think in a language. And so there's always going to be some determinacy, but we have multiple languages as human beings. And so we also know that there's differences between languages, and we can, to some degree, overcome those. Most individual human beings are definitely going to be limited in their thinking processes by their language, and usually without realizing it. But that doesn't mean that we're always like stuck in our own like hermetic bubble, that we have our own form of life and it's radically incommensurable with somebody else's form of life, the way some people interpreting Wittgenstein did. All right, here's a question from CS. What do I think about Husserl? Was he originally inspired by Descartes? Is there such a thing as first philosophy, really? So you got a couple different questions there. Let's talk about Husserl's inspiration by Descartes. I suppose people think so because of the Cartesian meditations, right? But Husserl's also, he's deeply influenced by Hume on the issue of association of ideas, and he's very much in conversation with the neo-Kantians of his time. So I would say no, he's not primarily or originally influenced by Descartes. As a matter of fact, one of the people who he's working off of, Brentano, is a neo-scholastic who's trying to resuscitate Aristotle. So Husserl, like most other philosophers, is drawing upon multiple sources, and he's got his own particular sets of interests that he's bringing to it. What do I think about Husserl? I think Husserl is one of the most boring people to read, and I even have people read Jeremy Bentham, and he's pretty dry too. But he's worth reading. It's an exercise you probably should go through at some time or another. I'll mention that Husserl scholars are often kind of an interesting bunch in the sense of interesting that they definitely have their shtick. They are very nerdy in general and tend to be a lot like a certain style of old school analytics. But they're decent people, and I've worked with quite a few of them. I actually wrote my master's thesis on Husserl and the passive synthesis lectures that were recently, at that time, being translated by Tony Steinbach. I don't find Husserl interesting enough to really draw upon very much. When it comes to phenomenology, I'm much more interested in people like Marcel and Heidegger and Shaler. among the early phenomenologists. Edith Stein as well. Maurice Blondel, who's doing something very similar to phenomenology, and Bergson, of course, who's doing something similar with his essay on the immediate givens of consciousness. But, Husserl's worth reading. Now, is there such a thing as first philosophy? It depends on what philosopher you ask, because, what's recommended as first philosophy is the thing that's like foundational for everything else. So a lot of the phenomenologists regarded phenomenology as like supplying a first philosophy. The people who got into semiotics turned that into first philosophy. The people who were doing, even though they would deny this, who were doing like ordinary language analysis in the analytic movement, were doing that essentially as first philosophy as well. Kant's critiques are supposed to supply a certain kind of first philosophy. Levinas talks about ethics as first philosophy. I'm actually much more inclined to the notion of ethics and the study of values as being closer to the core of things. And I would say there I'm in agreement with Shaler and von Hildenbrand and Marcel and people like that. But is there really a first philosophy in any methodological sense where you have to begin with that? I don't think so. There's a lot of ways of doing philosophy. And, I won't say that they're all equally legitimate or anything like that, but some, there's certainly a pluralism possible, I would say. All right. Let's see. What do we got here? Abdul. Is the history of all hitherto existing society the history of class struggles? Asking for a friend. If you mean in the reductive sense as only being the history of class struggles, then definitely no. If you mean does it include and encompass and is it useful to look at class struggles? Yes. Class and economics is certainly a vital domain of human existence, but I don't think we should reduce it like that. All right, Bob Jackson writes, I'm suffering serious health problems because of my illness. Is it justified to kill yourself when life becomes worse every day and you will die soon? There's different points of view on that. The Stoics, for example, thought that if things become unendurable, that one could legitimately leave, but that a lot of people were using that as a pretext to simply try to escape things. If it becomes worse and worse every day and you have no prognosis of things ever becoming better, if you are going to die soon, then it seems like in some respects it's less of an issue than knowing that you're going to linger on for years and years. Because if you are going to die soon, something else is determining that, deciding that for you. So if you're asking, like, is it better to die a week before one would die? But usually the questions are things like, I'm going to die soon, but I want to avoid the horrible pain that's going to come with that. If you're asking what my personal view is, I think in a case like the latter, that it would be morally legitimate to do that. And many people indeed do that. The other thing to keep in mind too, I would say, and I don't know your situation, is you have to think about the people that you're leaving behind as well, and how what you do is going to affect them. In some cases, I think for some people, ending one's life sooner would be a relief for those who are involved with them, right? Or taking on responsibilities with them. In other cases, it would be viewed as a sort of betrayal or a abandonment. So these are not things that there's easy answers for. I do have some clients, and I've had clients in the past who are faced with these sorts of issues in my philosophical counseling clients. So, all right. Lyndon asks, even though I'm not a Hegelian, how useful do I find his ideas as an intellectual tool in making sense of the world in general? Somewhat useful. I can usually tell that at different points in time more than others. And I'm not a Hegelian in the sense that I think that Hegel had the blueprint for everything and made sense out of everything. So, and I think the end of history stuff is nonsense too. But you can recognize when you've been studying his work for a while, you can recognize certain dynamics as kind of common, right? Um, and that's very helpful. I will say this too, and this is going to seem like a bit of a rant. The interpretation of Hegel that takes the master-slave dialectic as absolutely centrally important is complete nonsense. Mika! I got the dog and the cat raising trouble with each other. The cat is trying to crawl up on top of the dog. Believe it or not, the dog's not interested in this being 1/10 her size crawling on her. So she'll probably come over here by me in a moment. So in any case, yeah, Hegel can be very helpful and useful. Here comes the cat. I'll let you take a look. See, there she is, getting into trouble. But the master-slave dialectic. There's also probably the second most commonly referenced thing is the beautiful soul, which is part of the morality section, and that's good to check out. But again, you got to be really careful in identifying these gestalts, of consciousness everywhere. Here's another one from CS. How does one avoid always learning and never being able to arrive at a knowledge of the truth? Just settle on Aristotle as a foundation. Well, I mean, I don't think it's a problem to always be learning. I mean, even if you have a foundation, you're a finite being and you don't know much of anything. So you should always be learning constantly. You should be learning about the beings around you and, sort of, you might say, entering into their lives more and more deeply all the time. So it's not always learning that's the problem. I think the thing that you're worried about more is like whether that learning is replacing other learning, whether you're ever going to like get to the bottom of things, right? And why would you settle on Aristotle as a foundation? Aristotle's works are incredibly underdetermined and written in a time and culture 2 millennia ago. Why wouldn't you like draw upon a variety of different thinkers? Why not be an eclectic like Cicero was, or like I am, or what James would call a pluralist? I mean, I like Aristotle quite a bit, but I wouldn't want to try to use his categories and metaphysics, let alone his totally outdated biology, as the basis for understanding this amazing universe that we're in, or the very interesting things that we human beings are. So that's as good of an answer, I think, as I can provide about that. Bruno, any favorite cultures in history? I guess the ancient Greek and Roman for their philosophy, but any others? So I'll do another little rant here. There is no such thing as Greek or Roman culture. That's all fabricated bullshit later on by people who wanted to use that to sort of appropriate it and justify how cool they were because they were bringing that in. If you actually study ancient Greece and its connections with all these other places, you come to realize there isn't one single culture. There is like all these different fragments of things connected with each other in different ways. And it's the same thing for Rome, and it's the same thing for Persia, and it's the same thing for Egypt or China or any of these, India. There's such an interesting melange, and there's all these transfers going on. So, do I have a favorite culture? I don't. I would love if we could get away from trying to appropriate cultures the way that people in the past did with these artificial constructs that we call races as well. It's such sloppy ways of arranging and valuing things. So there's better ways of doing it. I don't usually think in these terms. Like I'm not thinking I'm studying Aristotle because he's a Greek and Greek culture is really important. I'm studying Aristotle because there's interesting ideas there. And if I'd happen to get those interesting ideas from an Indian philosopher or Chinese philosopher, had I read Sanskrit or classical Chinese, I'd be just as happy getting them from them. Because because it's the ideas that I'm really much more interested in, rather than trying to hold on to culture. Zama, sometimes philosophy of Wittgenstein and Heidegger looks so similar, but their style looks so different. If there is, could you explain similarities between them? So Alistair McIntyre, in a famous interview that was carried out in the journal Kinesis, said that he thought that Heidegger was an important philosopher, mainly because Heidegger had gotten so many things wrong and so many people were following him, and Wittgenstein was an important philosopher in a different way. And I would reverse it. I actually think that Heidegger got way more stuff right and went way deeper in his examinations of things than Wittgenstein did. Wittgenstein circled around stuff and came up with some cool ideas, but he really impoverished himself by not doing enough reading and not doing enough deep engagement with the people that he talks about. I mean, people be like, well, he definitely read Augustine. He read a little bit of Augustine, but he doesn't seem to have thought through very much of Augustine, because he's got this, he got enough to get the Augustinian picture of language, and that was it. I think that the Wittgensteinian notion of language game and some of the things that he's doing in philosophical investigations, remarks on the foundations of mathematics, uncertainty, these later works are really worth thinking about, and they can take you a little bit further than Heidegger does on some things. But Heidegger had the benefit of really reading Aristotle and thinking about Aristotle, really reading Plato and thinking about Plato. Of course, he's deficient when it comes to the Hellenistic philosophers, but even really thinking through Descartes and Kant and stuff like that gave him a incredible advantage. So now, they are doing something kind of similar in that they're anti-foundationalist, but so are so many others. That's why Richard Rorty, in his The Mirror of Nature, could say that he's drawing on Wittgenstein from the analytic tradition, Heidegger from the continental tradition, and John Dewey from the American tradition. There's so many others that they could have drawn on as well. But those are the correlations he's making. So, all right, Snoo. People often praise the love of learning, but how does one actually foster one's love of learning? Are there interesting philosophers who wrote about it? I suppose there must be, but Plato talks about it in the Republic, doesn't he? How one fosters that, but I think there's no recipe for it. You're talking in a way about what we often call second order desires. A love of learning is a desire for learning, being oriented towards learning. And you could maybe like that to a certain extent, but not as much as you would like to do, or you struggle because you don't get as much affectively out of learning. You don't get as much enjoyment as you'd like, and you'd like that to be different. So the good news is, one way you can change that is by doing more and more of it, because a lot of learning is, and this is one thing where I think that the Aristotle and the interpreters of Aristotle got something right. Intellectual excellences are habits. They're not habits in the sense of not chewing your fingernails or things like that. They are these complexes that we build up, and they're built up through action after action after action. Thinking is an action. Choosing to think about something is an action. Choosing to study something is an action. So doing that over and over again builds up these complexes that we call a habitus or a hexis in Greek. So that is part of it. I'm sure there's probably all sorts of literature out there about that, but I don't know too much about that. So, all right, Guillaume, what is the Philosopher's Stone? There was a legendary thing that would turn lead into gold. So not anything really connected with philosophy in the sense that we talk about today. Just go pet her. Let's see. Chloe asks, would I be able to shed some light on why Plato in the Republic finds it necessary to prove the analogy between the city and the soul exists? He doesn't prove an analogy between the city and the soul exists. He sets out an analogy and then he discusses it. I don't know that he proves anything there. I'm not sure where that's coming from, that notion of proof. Why is it important? He tells you right there in the thing. It's too hard to look at the soul by itself. Maybe if we look at something bigger, he's got that analogy of the letters, right? We look at something with smaller letters and bigger letters, we might more easily be able to read them. Alexandra, what's your thoughts on Friedrich Hayek's political philosophy? Have you read any of his political works? I mean, I read Hayek a long time ago, but not enough to be able to say much about it other than I don't find him particularly interesting. And, I often judge philosophers when I don't have the time to do so based on the people I see recommending him. And, I don't see a lot of people who I respect intellectually who are like super into Hayek. And the people who are into Hayek seem to be like really into Hayek. Every once in a while I get like, oh, you should look at this from a praxeological perspective. And I'm like, oh my God, one of those again. So I'm probably disappointing you in that respect. Bruno, do I recommend the writings of any particular historian? For what? I mean, for history in general, it would depend on what particular thing you're asking about, and probably not. I mean, I'm not a historiographer, so. All right, Titus Andronicus, who in your opinion is the greatest or most important American philosopher? So that's an interesting one. In terms of importance, like influence on things, I would say John Dewey definitely is the most important in that sense, but I don't like to read Dewey because I don't think he's a very good writer, so very unclear at points. And I don't agree with a lot of his sort of assessments and assumptions. I would say the greatest American philosopher that, from classical American philosophy is Josiah Royce. I also do like Peirce and James, but I'd probably give Royce the edge on them. So, all right, R.T. Whitby, who created the correspondence of theory of truth? Was it Socrates, Plato, Aristotle? None of them. I mean, we didn't start talking in terms of correspondence theory of truth until like the 19th century, I think. So, yeah, go and bring her in the other room. This whole notion of like reading this stuff backwards into people is bad history of ideas, and it's usually done for the purpose of, like right now, correspondence theory of truth, because of Boghossian's wrong-headed article that's trying to blow it up into like a whole way of being. Sometimes they'll substitute the word realism for that. That's all nonsense. That's crappy history of ideas. You can see Plato and Aristotle talking about things that we nowadays call correspondence theory of truth. You can also find Aristotle talking about truth in other ways. So it's really important not to try to like assume some philosophical legitimacy by tying these things in with these people. I mean, the notion that in some cases of truth in language or thought would be a resemblance or correspondence between what is in the mind or in language and what is actually in the world. There is no originator of that. That's been around for a long time, and that's one notion of truth. And truth also, in the sense of what's later called the pragmatic theory of truth, or what's later called the coherence theory of truth, you can find that in ancient philosophy as well. So it's kind of a non-starter as a question. Here's another one. Western man, are you more inclined towards idealism or empiricism after your lifetime of studies? I'm not inclined towards any isms. They almost always turn out to be too reductive to be of any use to me. I want to understand things adequately, and that's just not possible, buying into those sorts of things. It's kind of cool that these big programs are no longer dominating the philosophical scheme, and we can get back to like actually doing philosophy. R.T. Whitby, why did Plato change kalos kagathos to agathos kai sophos? I don't know. I mean, reference the text in which he does that. Again, that sounds like something that's coming out of somebody's History of Ideas book. Leah, are you going to do more of Seneca's letters? I am indeed, because I need them for my classes. These core concept videos I'm typically doing for my students in my classes, and then they're for the rest of the world as well. So I'll certainly be doing that. Auntie Gaia, what are some contemporary philosophical fiction writers you would recommend? Well, one, it's funny that you would ask that, because this coming week I'll be talking about one of them, whose books I've read my way through over the last month and a half. We're finishing up the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series, and I'll be talking about R. Scott Bakker, who was not even like on my radar at all until he got voted in the last year's vote for who would be the big names for the last 3 sessions. And I read his Prince of Nothing series, which is 3 books, and then I read his Aspect Emperor series, which is the next 4 books in the Second Apocalypse arc. It's incredibly philosophical. It's very dark. You should think of sort of like J.R.R. Tolkien meets George R.R. Martin meets R.R. Martin meets Frank Herbert, and a couple other things mixed in as well, and that's what you've got there. And so that's quite good. You can never go wrong with Philip Dick. Very philosophical writer. A lot of his characters are like talking philosophy in their discourses and making interesting things out of them. And there's plenty others as well, you know. I would say one of the things about speculative fiction is it offers you the opportunity to work in a broad canvas with ideas. So, you know, C.J. Chera is somebody who's doing that in her Alliance Union universe. But there's many others that we could talk about as well. Nathan Packard, can you explain Nietzsche's ideas on causality? I'm not sure which ideas you mean. Maybe you're talking about his notion that is expressed at various points in his work that we have hypostatized cause and effect into, you know, thinking that there really is a thing called cause and effect, and you know, that's something we can rely upon, like law, like regularity. He thinks that the universe doesn't really operate in that way, that a lot of it is this dynamism of the will. But that's not to say that some things don't work in that way. So, Saad, do I think when studying philosophy, some branches must be studied before others? Maybe. It depends on who you're studying it with, I guess. Depends on what kind of student you are. If you're asking me the question of, is a program necessary where like you do logic before everything else, or you do metaphysics and you like get that completely out of the way before anything else? No, because you're going to read and reread and reread. Doing philosophy is a continual process of going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Any philosophical text that you want to actually understand, expect to read it at least 10 times. And some of those readings should not be right after the previous reading. It should be after you've read somebody else and thought about some other things. So no, there isn't any like absolute sequence or program that you would need to do. R.T. Whitby, what would Plato and Aristotle think of the Stoic, anti-intellectual, anti-knowledge position that you should not seek externals? Knowledge is an external, and therefore you should not seek knowledge. Well, that's a complete distortion of Stoic doctrine, so I'm not even going to bother with that. It's a non-starter. Kieran, have you noticed that Heidegger is making a resurgence as a result of the climate crisis that pushes for more technology in the form of wind farms, solar power, tidal power, etc.? I think that has absolutely nothing to do with Heidegger at all. Heidegger has been of perennial interest in continental circles. There are a few analytics who are interested in Heidegger. I mean, at the place where my wife is still working on her dissertation, European graduate school, Heidegger is basically the guy you start with. So, you know, Heidegger is a great thinker, like most great thinkers, has some interesting contributions to make, also has some big blind spots. But he's not making, I don't see Heidegger making a big comeback right now. I think there's been a continual interest in him. Liberty et le soir. What do I think of Ludwig von Mises? Not too much. Not somebody I spend time on. Raid, what do I think of Max Stirner's philosophy and his similarities to Nietzsche? I think there are similarities to Nietzsche. I like Stirner. He's an interesting figure. I will be doing some videos on him because I'm expanding my discussions of egoism for my ethics classes that I'm teaching this coming semester. So, you know, I'll be doing some things on the classic work of his, really the only work of his that anyone, I think, reads, The Ego and Its Own. There's another translation of it out there, The Unique in Its Property, right? So interesting stuff. I think that his union of egoists is a complete non-starter. That would never actually work. But he's fun. He's fun to read and talk about. Underdog tactics. Can I talk about my therapy practice? What is my treatment approach? I don't have a therapy practice because therapy is medical. I have a philosophical counseling practice, and that's more of a coaching focus. There is no one single modality that I do. Sometimes I suggest readings and we discuss them. We talk about how they apply to the person's life. Sometimes we look at the ways in which people are having, emotions arise for them, particularly anger and anxiety in particular situations, and we're examining the thought processes that go into them and figuring out what we could do to try to head those off. A lot of reframing exercises. I draw upon, a lot of different philosophical approaches, since people have been discussing these issues for several thousand years now. But I also draw upon other approaches as well. I mean, it depends on who the client is and what they're looking for. A lot of what we do is quite dialogical, back and forth. And some of it is essentially business coaching, or executive coaching, helping people figure out where they want to go with their careers, how to make their value systems actually less contradictory so that they're not living these compartmentalized lives. That's pretty much it. Sisyphus, can I explain Hegel's determinate negation of negation with something being concrete as a result? I mean, that's, a formula, but without actually focusing on a particular dynamic, that's about as close to the phenomena as you can get, I think. Copper King, what is wickedness of a devil? I don't know. Probably general wickedness carried out by a being lacking a physical body and therefore not encumbered by all the things that we are. I don't know. I don't know what the reference point for that is. Joshua, did the Christian existentialist influence my current theological beliefs? If you haven't before, would you talk a bit about your book? So two totally different questions there. Yeah, I mean, the Christian existentialists have influenced my current theological beliefs. I mean, I don't know that I have theological beliefs. I have practices, and I have sort of a framework. I've said this so many times, and I'll say it again. The writers who I find particularly interesting when it comes to religion are not the ones for whom religion solved any of their problems. It's the ones where it gave them a greater view on the universe, on themselves, on other human beings, and on whatever it is that we call the divine, and it made things incredibly more complicated and contradictory in the process. So, I don't like apologetics. I find apologetists boring and, rigid, and I like people who face up to how complicated a mess this thing is, and think that religion provides some sort of insights into that. So Kierkegaard, plays a role in my thought, as does Shestov, as does Blondel, as does Pascal. All these people that sometimes get called Christian existentialists. I mean, Shestov is Jewish, but he writes a lot about the New Testament as well. Now, my book. So my book is a set of translations. Come on up, Pika. Set of translations with a about 100-page historical introduction and a 25-page chronological bibliography, and it's about the Christian philosophy debates of the 1930s, which involved about 50 different Francophone philosophers. It got started originally with some discussions between, at the Société Française de Philosophie, between Etienne Gilson and Jacques Maritain on one side, although there was already a letter from Blondel that was appended to it. Yeah, them on one side, and then Brehier and Brunswig on the rationalist side. And there were actually some other letters from some other thinkers as well that were added to the original thing that didn't make it into the translation because the Société Française de Philosophie wouldn't allow me to add that into the book. But then there's all these other interventions that were quite important. And I would say that even after my translation, only about maybe a fifth of the literature from the debate has actually been translated. So there's quite a bit more to do. I just haven't had the time to follow up with all of that myself. So, all right. Spa bed. Do I subscribe to the notion there is an end of history, that history is a process of the improvement of mankind? No. I think that, to begin with, there isn't a process of history. There's all sorts of histories interweaving with each other. And I think that part of what's going on is we also decide what kind of history we want to be continuing on through. So right now we're posed with, like one of the fundamental questions of our time is, are we going to get our shit together enough politically so that we can actually address some of the things that will otherwise destroy the human race? Whether climate change proceeds in exactly the way that the models predict, we're using up a lot of resources, polluting a lot of stuff, and we're not going to make it out to the stars anytime soon enough to do much about that. So this is the world we've got, and if we can't decide as a species to quit screwing things up, we're screwed. And history becomes a moot point at that point, because it'll be an alien civilization with their archaeologists figuring out what was going on here, And there's other things that are equally pressing. I mean, all it would take is one massive pandemic to really derail the civilization that we live in, which is so incredibly dependent on all these massive networks maintaining themselves. So, those are the sort of things that we're going to have to face up to. There is no automatic guaranteed we're gonna deal with these things right. And there isn't, there could be some sort of divine intervention where, whatever the divine is comes in, just open it up and, fixes everything. But that is so incredibly improbable. And quite frankly, I don't think that a just God would come in and do that, or if they did, they'd make all the people who have been screwing things up pay for what they've been doing. So no, I don't think there's any sort of automatic advance in history. I mean, look at it in our own time. Just think about race relations. People got so ticked off about there being a black president, and this temporary enthusiasm of the post-racial America that we swung back into some of the worst kinds of racism and atavism that are now becoming normalized. Definitely making a regress in terms of those sorts of things. Although they probably wouldn't see it as a regress. The people who are in favor of that, they'd see it as progress, tearing the false liberalism down or something like that. But yeah, so that's probably enough on that. Dimitri, okay, my more specific question, do you see any merit in the so-called event of the melding of the sexual and the technological and postmodern art, e.g. Ballard, the Alien series, etc.? Do I see any merit? Yeah, I think that art is interesting art. I don't think it's an event. I think it's you could say it's a whole bunch of events that are strung together like a network into a process. I'll have to read Ballard. I read Crash years ago. Was not impressed. But then again, I'm not impressed by a lot of these we didn't call them postmodern, but these late modern authors that were the darlings of the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. But going to be reading them this year, so we'll see what I make of them then. If you're talking about Geiger, that's interesting work. So yeah. Nils Cran, a teacher of mine, argues for rhetoric as first philosophy, as it all started there. Anyone can argue for anything. Good for your teacher. As it all started there. It all started with rhetoric. The schools of rhetoric arose later than the first philosophers, as we know. But both of them were later than the Homeric bards, so maybe we should say that's first philosophy, or I don't know, cave painting should be the whatever started there. So not a very useful, criterion, I think. Jocko Pick, how did I become such a good rhetoric? Is there anything special we should know? You're asking how I became a good rhetorician or became good at presenting? A lot of it is through repetition, doing lots and lots and lots of it. I've been teaching since 1998, I think. And I've been doing public speaking since, my first paid public speaking gig was 2008. But I was doing public speaking before that as well. And, I've studied classical rhetoric and I've, read a lot, and I pay attention to what people seem to respond to and what people don't. And rhetoric, is in part attentiveness to your audience. That's central to it. So that would be good. Thomas asks, any good books on rhetoric? Aristotle's Rhetoric, right? Plato discusses rhetoric in different places, including the Phaedrus, where he sets out the possibility of a good rhetoric. There's a whole classical tradition of paying attention to rhetoric that flows through, Cicero and Quintilian and people like Augustine. And then, there's cool stuff in the present, like, the late, the 20th century, like Chaim Perlman and Ulbricht's Kitka, I don't remember how the name is pronounced, the new rhetoric, or there's lots of great studies out there. Kenneth Burke is kind of cool. So, there's lots and lots you could read. All right. Crazy Fog, ever wanted to write your own philosophy rather than teach others? I don't see that as a dichotomy. Every time that I am teaching other people's philosophy and doing it well, I'm doing it. I'm the one who's giving voice to it. Sort of like translating. This is we place way too much stress on originality. I have insights every once in a while that I occasionally will write down. but they're usually going to be indebted to somebody else. And that's cool. That's perfectly fine by me, because I don't need to try to, do my own system or do something original. I think originality is extremely overrated. All right. Lenny Penny, any advice for someone who's 25 and doesn't really know what to do with his life? What's the right way to orient in his life? Yeah, do something, and maybe you'll find out that that's the thing that you actually like. And if you don't, then you can do something else. But you don't have to like figure out once and for all what you're going to be, because we're not medieval. Well, I mean, if you were a medieval peasant, you'd just stay a medieval peasant, right? You're not in some absolutely job stratified thing where you can't do something different. As a matter of fact, whatever career track you pick, you should probably expect that you won't get to remain in it the rest of your life, right? So, you should figure out what you actually value and start working with it. And sometimes it'll have to be on your off time. Not necessarily everything that you like will get you paid and allow you to maintain yourself and potentially a household and family. But you can still do it. I was just talking with my daughter about the fact that I used to do watercolors, and there's really no reason why I can't keep doing watercolor. I don't know why I stopped doing it, other than I got so busy, and maybe I'll start doing it again in the new year. So let's see here. T. Gaines, to what extent does Heidegger's definition of metaphysics differ from conventional metaphysics? I don't know what you mean by conventional metaphysics. There's so many different styles and types of metaphysics out there. Heidegger sees metaphysics in the way that Aristotle does, as the study of being qua being. He's bringing new tools to the table, and he also thinks that we can talk about epochal metaphysics. Maybe this is what you have in mind. So there's different epochs in which different fundamental ways of looking at what being is changes, and different ones are dominant. But Heidegger's definitely not the only person to think that thought. Hegel thought that thought too, and so did plenty of other people. I mean, even those who didn't formally conceptualize it are still getting at that sort of phenomenon. Tony Tiger, there are trends in philosophy. It would appear that currently, especially in the USA, existentialism is rather derided. Is this the case? Not really. Other question, is Derrida being taken more seriously now? No. So those are easy to answer. Let's see. Audio pervert. What of Adorno's The Frankfurt School essay on mass culture, how it maps out or applies today in a contemporary sense? Are you talking about the culture industry? I mean, you can. That's the thing where maybe you could go through it bit by bit and say, well, this stuff still holds and this stuff not so much. But you're talking about a book there, right? So how does it apply in a contemporary sense? You have to enter into the details with that sort of thing. Samuel says, a girl was so impressed with my knowledge of Hegel, I pulled her, bro. Thanks for half hour Hegel. Well, that's an unusual girl. Not too many people, male or female, are interested in Hegel. So if you found somebody who's a suitable romantic partner through talking about Hegel, that's great. I mean, could have been fly fishing. It could have been your share of cinnamon buns or coffee, but Hegel will do it then. All right. Just skipped up a bit. Let's see what we got here. Wow, there's a lot of people weighing in. I'm going to get rid of one of these people. All right. Let's see here. Get rid of General Lee. Let's see where we were. Okay. EB, what are my thoughts on Catherine Malibu's usage of Hegel with neuroscience and deconstruction? Haven't read her. My wife actually knows her, but I haven't gotten around to reading her, so there's nothing I can say about that. What are my thoughts on Logic and Existence by Jean Hippolyte? I like Hippolyte quite a bit as a Hegel commentator. I have not read Logic and Existence for a long, long time, so again, I don't have anything to say about that. Lyndon, how would I differentiate the material from the non-material? Does it need to become more ethereal due to modern physics? I haven't really thought much about that. In part because I'm willing to say that physics doesn't tell us enough about the material world that we encounter to really like subsume it, even physics plus chemistry plus biology, because all of this is material existence, and yet there's so much meaning packed in here that I don't think is just reducible to like neurons firing and being ordered in certain ways. I don't know. I'd have to think about that more. Thus spoke films. If you could bring any philosopher back to life to see how they will impact and respond to our time, which one would it be? That's a good one. I've often said that, I'd love to bring Aristotle to my college classrooms and then, show him the fact that more than half of my students are women and that they're definitely not deficient when it comes to the intellect by comparison to the male students, and then take them out to the bar and say, so I don't know, did you not have enough of a experiential basis to avoid saying those boneheaded things about women? Now maybe do you want to say anything different about barbarians or natural slaves or stuff like that? Because, Aristotle being a good Aristotelian in that respect, had he had different different experiences and the ability to disentangle himself from the culture that he was in, he probably would have seen stuff in a different manner. So that would be interesting. It's Sonobaka. I'm reading through Kant's First Critique and having a bit of trouble. What later philosophers, if any, do you feel have a firmer clarifying grasp on it? I don't know. I mean, I don't really read a lot of later philosophers going into great depth about Kant's First Critique. I just, when I need to read Kant's First Critique, I read Kant's First Critique. It is difficult, and you should expect it to be very difficult. So if you're only having a bit of trouble, actually, you're way ahead of the game. There are some things in Kant that I've been reading him for 25 years, maybe longer, and there's still some things where I'm like, what the hell is he talking about here exactly? Even in the moral philosophy, which is a lot easier than the theoretical philosophy. So, yeah. All right. Let me see. Bajidar, what do I think of Spengler's work? People have asked me that before. I think Spengler is at best a third-rate philosopher. There seem to be people who are quite into him, as there always have been. I was never very impressed by what I read, but it's been a long time since I read it. Hello, sir, are you a Stoic? No, I'm an eclectic. I draw upon Stoicism as I do Aristotelianism and Platonism, which, by the way, doesn't just mean Plato, but means Plutarch and means other later thinkers as well, as I do existentialism. And I think that there's a lot of useful things within Stoicism. That said, I probably know more about and have probably practiced more actual Stoic principles and practices than many of the Johnny-come-lately people who claim to be Stoics because they love to have a camp to identify with. But I don't identify as a Stoic, although I am, of course, the editor of Stoicism Today. Hannes, I have my cumulative, oh my goodness, I have my cumulative Hegel final on Tuesday. Wish me luck. Yeah, good luck, man. Your videos are the only thing saving me currently. Oh, that would be tough. Cumulative Hegel final. I don't know what they're going to ask you, but there's so much stuff packed in there. That's quite difficult. Sarah, I'm looking for a short intro to history of ideas. Any recommendations? Do you think understanding that is valuable and necessary for understanding literary fiction or art? So let's take the second one first. Understanding the history of ideas, is it valuable for understanding literary fiction or art? Definitely valuable. Is it necessary? Maybe not necessarily necessary, but it certainly can help. For example, I'll just, I don't know that much about art, but I'll tell you about one piece that I know quite a bit about because I had to do some research on it this summer for my existentialism class. The Scream, right? Edward Munch's The Scream. Helps to know about Kierkegaard because Munch was, as he tells us, influenced by Kierkegaard. And the scream is not the person screaming. The scream is what nature is doing, and the person is responding to it. So knowing something about Kierkegaard's discussions of the individual and anxiety and all that might also be cool to know that Munch later painted Nietzsche. So that's some history of ideas stuff. That's kind of cool. Short intro to history of ideas. I don't know of any such thing. As a matter of fact, any short intro is probably garbage, frankly, because the history of ideas is vast and deep. So any short intro has probably got an agenda and is going to be distorting some things. So, all right. Some neuroscientists say that the ego is an illusion and the sense of I is actually just illusion and there is no I. Why these findings don't change the world? Isn't these findings extraordinary? You know, it used to be that they'd say there's no bullshit that some philosopher won't eventually say, right? And we could probably change that to neuroscientists or evolutionary biologists or any of the other popular fields that, people do work in that have all sorts of, wild assumptions built into them and then get reported on in the popular press. So, I could be facetious and say, did that neuroscientist or probably journalist, because I'm guessing you didn't read this from a neuroscience journal, did they actually put their name in the byline? Because if so, they're being hypocritical. Oh, but there's no they to be hypocritical, right? I mean, some of this stuff gets so absurd so quickly. So what if some neuroscientists say that the ego is an illusion? Maybe they're full of crap. How do you know that they're actually getting it right? Why jump right in and assume that because they have the term neuroscientist that they're any better off than the rest of us, particularly when there's an entire literature going way, way back within not just philosophy, but religion and, literature itself about this very problem. I mean, would these findings be extraordinary within the field of Buddhism, which has been around, I don't know, a couple millennia? Not really. But again, you got to be really careful with this sort of stuff. Who's actually saying it? What is their basis for saying it? What assumptions have they made? What do they mean by ego? You see the same thing coming up with free will. Oh, they've proved free will doesn't exist. Whose version of free will? What concept of free will? I'm myself. I'm usually very skeptical about these sorts of claims. All right, Gambrick. Find myself wondering what Aristotle would say about a good friendship falling apart. Read Nicomachean Ethics, Book 9. He tells you all about it, so you don't have to wonder. All right. I'm skipping over the stuff about Zizek and Peterson because I've talked about that ad nauseum. I'm going to skip over the Noam Chomsky because I've talked about that plenty of times as well. And I'm also going to skip over the Rand stuff. I've said it often enough. Rand is a philosopher, a third-rate philosopher. Randians tend to be pretty crazy people. So is there any merit in exploring her work? Sure, as much merit as there is in exploring Spengler, or I'd also say Bertrand Russell's a third-rate philosopher too. But can't hurt to look at him. Muhammad asks, what do I think about Thomas Kuhn? So he was somebody interesting who we had to read when I was in grad school. The notion of paradigm shift it's useful. It's difficult to explain exactly how the shift takes place. I think the idea of paradigm shift got overblown quite a bit as they moved it out of philosophy of science and into other areas, but that's okay. The Arabic crafter, what's the most popular view about the external world held by philosophers in contemporary philosophy? I wouldn't possibly know because I've never done a poll of philosophers in contemporary philosophy. Watergate 2 would I recommend studying philosophy without philosophy classes? It depends on your situation. If you can afford to take philosophy classes, then it certainly wouldn't hurt to do so, provided you get a good professor. And if you get a bad professor in one place, just go to another place. But can you study philosophy without philosophy classes? Sure. I mean, that's what a lot of people have done. And, quite a few of the philosophers who I work on and study, I never had a class on them. We read Epictetus's Enchiridion in undergrad, but I never had a class on Stoic philosophy. You just, read the stuff and read whatever secondary lit you want to, and try putting it into practice. And every once in a while, bounce your ideas off of somebody else, and that's how you can learn. So, all right. Let's see. Equin, is critical theory philosophy? Are there any major limitations to their lens? Can it explain everything? So it depends on whose critical theory you mean. If you mean by the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, yeah, it's definitely philosophy. They're philosophers. Marcuse, Adorno, Horkheimer, Habermas, those types, right? Even Erich Fromm is a philosopher as well as a psychoanalyst. There's a broader sense of critical theory in which it doesn't just signify the Frankfurt School, and it's used in a more literary sense. And it depends on what you mean by philosophy in that case. There's no agreed upon definition of philosophy. Anyone who tries to tell you that there is, they're full of crap, and they're pushing their own agenda on you. So, is it philosophy? Yeah, although some of it's actually quite bad philosophy, but there's a lot of bad philosophy out there. So, Abdul, do I think Camus wrote interesting philosophy, or is he somewhat overrated as a philosopher? I think he's underrated as a philosopher because he's often presented as if he wasn't a philosopher and was just a literary figure who dabbled in philosophy, and that his philosophy isn't very good. You do have to get past his style if you're reading things like Myth of Sisyphus or his later The Rebel. I'd also put in there Letters to a German Friend as really central. So if you're looking at that stuff, you've got to get past the style in which he frames things. But there's some real philosophical depth there, I'd say. So he's an undervalued thing. EB, what is my thought on Badiou, Deleuze, and Derrida? I don't read Badiou, although, again, my wife has studied with him. And I don't read him not because I have an objection to him. I just haven't gotten to his work. Deleuze, I find some of Deleuze's stuff quite interesting. Not as big on the stuff that he does with Guattari. Derrida, some of his stuff is interesting. Whenever you read their stuff, you always have to ask, so this is pretty cool. Is any of this actually true, or is it bullshit? but you have to do that with everybody. Derek Bowser, I've heard Dietrich von Hildebrand is being considered to be made a doctor of the church. Is that warranted in your opinion? Well, I don't know. He's a great philosopher, I can tell you that, but I don't know who should be a doctor of the church, you know? All right. Jay Tunick, have I read anything from Maximus the Confessor? Thoughts on his philosophy and theology? Yeah, I've read Maximus. I mostly look at him when I'm looking at stuff about how concepts from Greek philosophy are getting brought further into time. I've never done like a systematic study of his work. So, all right. Audio pervert, what do I make of Jacques Derrida's hauntology? It does play out in electronic music today, synthwave being example. I'll have to take your word for that. I have no idea what synthwave even is. I don't listen to electronic music. So I suspect that they're probably, Derrida is complex and difficult to read and make sense of. So I suspect that they're probably taking some of his stuff and cutting out little bits and then using that and distorting it the way that usually happens whenever anybody moves philosophy into pop culture areas. But I don't know. I could be completely wrong. So, all right, let's see what else we've got. Elizabeth just came by to say thank you for your knowledge. You helped me in my philosophy class. You're very welcome. Glad it was helpful for you. Tamikuz, how does reference work across possible worlds? I don't know. You got to pick which possible world semantics you want. You'll probably find that in David Lewis. It's been a long time since I looked at that. So, Michael Guyer, McIntyre says virtue ethics must be examined in context of a tradition. How is this not a form of relativism? So there's an entire literature out there about that. McIntyre actually addresses some of that stuff, and if I remember right, in the preface to third edition of After Virtue, so you can read that stuff. But why would you jump from being understood in a tradition to relativism? They're not the same thing. Saying that you need to have some sort of basis in order to understand something, and that basis would not be something that all humans would automatically have. That's not the same thing as relativism. Relativism is a much stronger set of claims, saying there is no truth, across traditions or anything like that. And McIntyre deals with this stuff. So I would reread After Virtue. Let's see here. I'm going to start skipping through stuff to pick things that are easy to address. Boy, there's a lot of... Viver Benefica. Sir Russell said Hegel's all ideas are false. Why? I don't know that he said they're all false. That doesn't sound like Russell to me, because that would be insane to say that all of somebody's ideas are false. That wouldn't even make sense. All right, we got to skip down a bit more to find... here's a good question. John Ortiz. What are the fundamental skills of philosophy? And so there's many, but I'll talk about one in particular. One of the skills that you absolutely cannot do without in philosophy is making good distinctions at the right time. When people come out with these blanket statements of X is Y, you got to say, well, some X is Y, sure. And depends on what you mean by Y, because we want to be totally clear about things. I'm not going to jump onto your X is Y bandwagon just because you need a lot of likes or something like that. Let's carefully consider, what are the different X's you're talking about? What are the different Y's? And I'll tell you that when it comes to like the work that I do, particularly with businesses, but also with other academics, You know how like Arthur C. Clarke said that to the the primitive or the savage, um, technology appears to be a kind of magic. It's like that with philosophy and making distinctions. If you can make distinctions well, it seems like magic to people who cannot do that, who don't have that skill. They're like, "Holy crap! How did you know that?" And you're like, this is something that we've covered in this or this or this. So, all right. A lot of people asking the same question over and over again. I'm not sure why they're doing that. Like they think that I'll more likely answer it if it's been asked multiple times when it's actually the opposite. Here's another good one from Bolin sent. How do I deal with trolls on the internet? I ban them and block them very, very quickly. And as a matter of fact, I probably have a net that's erring on the side of banning people who aren't really trolls. But since my time is limited, and since I look at my social media and my videos as sort of like being my front porch, there's stuff that I'm putting, is content that I'm putting out there and other people can benefit from if they want to. If somebody wants to give me a hard time, I'm going to kick them out. And so that's what for a while I kind of wavered and I was like, oh, I should be more charitable and forgiving. And then I realized, I got maybe 40 good years left, if that. I'm not going to dick around, wasting it on people who want to be tendentious or just want to troll or waste my time. My time is valuable. Probably all of your time is valuable too. And that's the way that we should treat people who waste our time. You throw them out. You don't give them a chance. Um, and I've had a few people where they've like contacted me afterwards and apologized and I've like let them back in because we're talking about like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, other modes, sometimes LinkedIn. I've had to block people on LinkedIn as well. So yeah. All right. So that was a good question. Let's see here. Andre, how do you read Bakhtin's Carnivalesque? Boris Groys suggests Bakhtin wrote it in response and as a mirror to Stalin's purges. Well, that's an interesting thing. I haven't read Groys's anti-philosophy, and I imagine it's probably coming from there. So Bakhtin's Carnivalesque is talking about, it's coming from his Rabelais book, but it shows up in a few other places as well. It says that like the mode of the carnival is when like everything is switched and order has been subverted and that we do this every once in a while. It's not a radically new idea. Nietzsche's idea of the Dionysian is similar. There's other people who talked about this process as well. Does it make sense to see it in terms of Stalinism? I guess. Why a mirror to Stalinist purges? Because of the forced participation in the political. I mean, one of the things with Bakhtin is the political order in the carnival breaks down, right? It becomes subverted. So a mirror to Stalinist purges, a reversal of that. I guess that could make sense. Yeah. Um, Here we go. Andrew, was Heidegger an atheist? Did he believe in a personal God? I don't think you can say that he believed in a personal God. Was he an atheist? Depends on what kind of atheist you mean. I guess you could say he was an atheist in the way that Nietzsche was an atheist, the kind of person who would look at like most of the new atheism today and say, wow, you're just as much theological as the Christians who you're attacking. I mean, he's got that thing of only a God can save us, but people have made different things about that. All right, let's see what else we've got here. just jumped a bit. Leopoldal asks, do I think philosophy would make us less fragile? Depends on whose philosophy and how we're doing it. I mean, there are some pretty fragile Plato scholars out there that I've met, but Plato read properly and applied properly should make us less so. It really depends on how you're, the approach that you're taking to philosophy, and whether you're like turning it into kind of a game that we play with each other, or what we do it. Krajla Zembaka, will we ever get a video on Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of history? Well, you'll never get a video on anything that's a big work, because I don't try to summarize big works in a single video, because that's bad, doing bad philosophy, doing bad history of ideas, right? Like I said earlier, I shoot mainly at this point in time as supplements to my classes for my students. I'm not teaching Hegel's philosophy lectures on the philosophy of history in my classes, and I'm pretty busy with the half-hour Hegel project when I actually get to it. So, you might think about supporting the half-hour Hegel project and getting that done, and then afterwards we can talk about whether more Hegel stuff should be done. But if you want to commission me to shoot videos on it, you certainly can. People have done that with other things in the past, with Nietzsche and Heidegger. So, all right. Let me see if I can find a nice one to go out on, because we're almost at an hour and a half. A lot of people are asking me about things I don't have any idea about. Here's a good one, very quickly. Matt Myers, why do I think Anselm's philosophy is superior to Aquinas's? I don't. I don't think either is superior to either, and there's plenty of Thomists that think that Thomas is superior to everybody. So, I'm more interested in Anselm than I am Aquinas, but that's good enough. Oh, here's a good one. Phaedo remains. When reading Kierkegaard, do you think the pseudonyms he wrote under change how we should read him? In other words, are these supposed to be Kierkegaard's thoughts or the pseudonymous writer's thoughts? Well, they're both. And should it change how we read him? Sometimes, but it's not like we can always say, here's Kierkegaard and then here's the pseudonyms, and we should treat all the pseudonyms this way. You got to do it on a case-by-case basis. And for anybody who wants to make the strong claim that we absolutely can't read, this person as being Kierkegaard, well, they'd better say to the rest of us then precisely what we're supposed to be reading in there. Because I find a lot of this to be rather obscurantist and way of trying to be like one-upping other people. So let's see. A lot of stuff in here. Oh, here's a good one to go out on, especially this time of the year. Did I ever struggle with academic deadlines as a student? How do you deal with students facing such issues? If they're just having trouble meeting academic deadlines and they don't have some good reason for that, like a medical issue, like I have a student who's getting surgery this semester, at the end of the semester, because that's when they scheduled it, then they're, as we say, shit out of luck. They won't get the grades for the stuff that they've got. If it's some legitimate reason, then I give them an incomplete, and they get their work done when they can. I let students turn in work late with a penalty throughout the entire semester. I'm very forgiving when it comes to that sort of thing. I Did I have trouble with that? No, not so much. I've had more trouble later on as a professor getting stuff done on time, right? Just because I've always got so much work to do. But as a student, I didn't have too much trouble meeting my academic deadlines. I'd usually get stuff done ahead of time. But, I understand that those sort of things happen. I think the biggest thing to keep in mind is that a lot of students get very obsessed about their grades, and grades are not as important as people make them out to be. Most employers are not going to care about what your GPA is. And you could say, well, this is going to keep me from getting into graduate school. If a bad grade on an assignment is what's going to keep you out of getting into graduate school, it's not that grade that's keeping you out. It's the whole string of other bad grades that this one is like, the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back. If you're already doing well, you can take a couple big hits, academically speaking. If you're not, that's because you've already got a habit of not turning stuff in when you should, and not doing things the way that you ought to be doing. And then it's a more like learning time management, or deciding whether you really want to do this course of studies. So that's probably a good thing to go out on. I think this is probably the last. I mean, I might do some philosophy pop-ups over the Christmas season once all my grades are in. I've got so much work to do now the rest of this weekend. So we'll see how that goes. But I might do some other pop-ups. So those would be other streaming things as well. But otherwise, hope everybody has a great holiday season. And those who are in town, maybe I'll see you at some of our face-to-face events, or in some of the other online events. And that's it from here.